Hi everybody, it's me, the Fetch, host of Inside the Eye Live. Before the Sunday mainstream media political pundit talk shows, there is Inside the Eye Live, where we break down some of the weekly mainstream media talking points before the talking points even get aired. Add in some entertaining stories, weather, cats, intriguing and informative guests, and you get one of the most listened to Saturday morning streaming media political talk shows going today. And it's all right here on our flagship station, Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. So join me, The Fetch, for Inside the Eye Live every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock a.m. Eastern. It is truly intelligent media for the politically aware.
Welcome to Sacred Matrix, a divine paradigm of love and universal consciousness, with your host, Janet Kira Lessin and Dr. Sasha Lessin.
Together, we transform the world.
And now, here are your hosts, Janet Kira and Dr. Sasha Lessin.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sacred Matrix on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. And I'm your host, Janet Kira Lessin, with my co-host, Dr. Sasha Lessin, and presidential candidate, Andrew D-basiago. And as you may well know, we've interviewed Andy before. He is a prominent figure in the truth movement, and for more than 10 years, he has shared with the American people the true facts of our great nation's accomplishments in time travel and Mars visitation. He has done so as one who served bravely in the two secret U.S. defense projects in which time travel on Earth and voyages to Mars were first undertaken. As a result of his courageous advocacy as a crusading lawyer, Andy is credited with ending the time travel and Mars cover-ups by the U.S. government on behalf of the American people. This arduous work in the vineyards of the truth movement represented historic breakthroughs in America's understanding of our past and our prospects for the future. And today, Andrew D-basiago is running for President of the United States with a new agenda for a new America. Dr. Lessin, what would you like to say before we bring on Andy?
Okay, so what Andy has shown us and documented very well is the power of time travel to find out what's going to happen. And when a faction that's in control sees what favorable results happen in a certain direction, they nudge it along. And so this incredible power that goes with knowing the future belongs to the elite. And what Andy wants to do is make this information available to all of us. So listen up.
So Andy, we've had a busy month with all the conventions, and we're getting some feedback here. Welcome to the show, and how are you today? I've got a lot of feedback here. Can you hear us?
I'm very well. You sound great to me. I don't hear any feedback at all.
Okay, good.
I'm great. Funny thing happened on the way to the White House. I almost lost my left foot.
Oh, no. What happened?
But maybe it would be instructive because it was such an innocuous threat to my health that maybe it would save somebody else's life or limb by just discussing it briefly at the top of the show. Basically, all that happened was I had a chocolate lab puppy try to jump up on my lap, but he or she fell short, and her paw created an elliptical serration on my ankle. And, being trained as a kid in a secret defense project where I was time traveling, where I basically had to not only play when I was hurt, but just sort of not so much plug and play, but, tear off loose skin and run when it was required. After the injury, rather than going and getting it stitched back together, I did a stupid thing, which is I went into the bathroom, put my foot up into the sink, and I basically completed the wound. I got rid of the skin that had been torn off, thinking that it was just a very minor wound. In fact, it was down to the fat, and by tearing it in that way, I created a circular wound that then was healing. It was completely filled in with scar tissue, and I thought it was closed from any, it was impervious to infection. And I went swimming at a local swimming pool, and it got infected. Had I known it had any chance of being, open to being infected, I wouldn't have went swimming, because I thought it was closed because of the collagenous tissue that forms a scar had hardened and everything, and it got infected. And I have a real aversion to allopathic medicine, because I know they kill as many patients as they save. And my staff, Karen Kinnison, insisted that I go in because my foot was starting to get discolored. And when I went into the doctor at a local urgent care for the sort of the HMO that I've been relying on here while my presidential campaign has been based in North Carolina, he sat me down and he said, they're very upfront in North Carolina. That must be a very shallow standard of medical negligence in the state, because he said, partner, I'm sure glad you brought your foot in to see me today. And I said, why, doctor? He said, if you had brought it in if you had brought this infected foot in tomorrow, I'm afraid I might have had to sit you down and explain how I was going to have to take your leg off below the knee.
Oh, my God.
Kidding me. And he said, no, your foot's really infected, and I'm going to try to save it for you, but I'm going to put you on 2 sulfur-based full-spectrum antibiotics. Those are the very powerful ones that just blow you away. I was involuntarily revisiting every negative thing that had happened to me since like junior high school when I was on them. I just got into this very scary place in terms of just the mental effects of being on these really powerful drugs. And they worked, but he said he was so concerned that he said, I'm going to call in his prescription. He verified what my local pharmacy was, and he said, or I've been staying here in Charlotte, North Carolina, and he said, I'm going to call this in. I want you to go from here, go to any kind of fast food joint where you can get a Coke, a Sprite, or whatever. Then I want you to go over to the window at the pharmacy. And I said, why should I do that, doctor? And he said, I want you to take these antibiotics right after they pass them through the window to you. I don't want to find out tomorrow that you're back in here and I'm going to have to take your foot off because you didn't take them. You left them until tomorrow morning to take them. I want you to take these antibiotics as soon as possible, as soon as you get the bottle, as soon as you get the prescription. I want you to open it up, take your Sprite from a local, whatever, Burger King, and take the recommended dose, and then stay on the schedule because, we're in a fight here to save your foot. He said, I've seen people lose their foot for worse infections. It was really super infected. So after about 4 or 5 days, the swelling and discoloration went down, and it was clear that I was out of harm's way immediately, but I was really on the razor's edge of concern about losing my foot for a number of weeks. So that's sort of the untold medical story of my 2016 campaign. Is I had the most serious health crisis of a very blessed life that I've lived in terms of my health. I've enjoyed robust, good health my entire life, and I'm 54 this year, so I'll soon be 55 in September. So it was really the first time I had to confront, elements of, your mortality, because I was literally on the razor's edge of potentially having an amputation, and it was it was very, very scary, and I'm just very, very grateful to Karen and my physicians, Scott Trufant and Ray Mays, for saving my foot. So bless their hearts.
We're glad to hear you're okay. That was scary. Wow.
Yeah, you don't shade your body until you start potentially losing parts of it, So it was a big deal. I felt like a Civil War soldier who had been wounded in the ankle. I didn't know whether I was going to have to give up my part of my leg. So anyway, not to dwell on.
Speaking of disclosure, then, let's just if we have all the true technologies that our secret space program and military and everybody has, I'm sure we would be in other technologies that could, so when it had to get cut off, they could regrow it. Like, we talk about with Randy Kramer and all those other secret military
Yeah,
people, super soldiers.
when the boy lost his foot, by the way, this hasn't really been reported in the media yet, but I might as well share it on your show, and that is that we've identified the boy who lost his foot teleporting to Santa Fe, his feet, I should say. And he was
Right.
not a kid from another school. He was actually a kid named Kevin. We don't want to reveal his last name until we have his permission to bring him forward publicly. But his name was Kevin.
Right.
He was known as Scott in the program. And I identified him through a number of means. So we're gonna roll that out fairly soon. I have another teleportee that I'm going to roll out on August 12th on Truth Frequency Radio with Chris and Cherie Geo. But we've identified the boy who lost his feet teleporting to Santa Fe. And you may recall that after that incident, which took place at the Leah Harvey Junior High School grounds, after that school had been shut down on the way to redesigning that complex into what is now the county courthouse complex in Santa Fe, that I asked my father whether that could happen to me, and he said, yes, theoretically. And I said, does it happen to me? And he said, no. And I said, how do you know that, Dad? And he said, well, we've used the chronovisor to obtain forward images of you, and we found images of you practicing law in your 90s. You're going to become a lawyer when you grow up. And we calculated what year it was. We're able to ascertain what year we're capturing images from with the device. And you were like making an oral argument in court at 93. Now, here's the rub, though.
Wow.
And I had a discussion with my fellow Mars jumper, Bernard Mendez, yesterday and this morning, actually, again. And he said that I have to be kind of cautious about drawing conclusions based on the evidence of the future that Project Pegasus was obtaining, because when I was on the project and even later, when we were serving together, not in the 1970s in time travel, which we didn't serve together, but we then served together on the Mars Jump Room program in the early 1980s. Back in the day, they were still unable to discern the difference between essentially linear and nonlinear data from, for example, the future. So if they obtained information, for example, that they saw me practicing law at 93 in some courthouse in Washington State or a federal courtroom, there was a likelihood that because I would become a lawyer, this is kind of how it falls together, because I was destined to become a lawyer and would be a lawyer for my whole life from age, well, let's say 35 when I finally passed the bar, obtaining my law degree at age 30, and then I got additional graduate education, then passed the bar at 35 years of age, that because I could be expected to practice for at least, let's say, 35, 40 years till age 70, 75, or later if I live to be 100, that because that's an extensive amount of time as a lawyer, the finding that I would be a lawyer would be present on all future timelines, including this one, but that a specific detail about my legal career, my lifelong legal career, could vary. I mean, I could retire at 60, 65, 70, 75, 80, etc. So that Bernard basically admonished me to not look too deeply into things that I learned about my future or the future when I was serving on Project Pegasus, because he has a stronger aversion to the notion that Pegasus was identifying specific things. In other words, they could identify trends, but not specific data. Like they could predict, let's say, that Garth Brooks was going to be a huge recording artist, because in all of the adjacent timelines that they could study with the chronovisor, there he was. He was Garth Brooks' recording star. But they were having difficulty doing things like identifying, let's say, the song title of Garth Brooks' first #1 hit or first country and western hit. Okay,
But
so that's...
Andy, wait, they did really well in identifying the guy whose dog didn't hunt, and the bushes, and you. That seems like real specific.
Well, we know from my personal experience on the project, going back in a linear sense, back to my my experiences on the project before I was even bumped to that beta timeline, that they had identified George H.W. Bush, William Jefferson Clinton, George Walker Bush, and Barack Hussein Obama as future presidents, and they had identified me as a future president. And we now know that there was a future presidential hopeful in our Mars jump room experience as verified by a family member of his to me personally, and somebody I thought I had encountered on the surface of Mars, and I think I know his connection. And that was H. Ross Perot. We now believe that H. Ross Perot, in his 50s, was one of the Mars jumpers. And what would be the connection there? Well, you may recall that Bernard Mendez and I have given whistleblower testimony how during the Reagan years, 82, 83 timeframe, we had encountered Jimmy Carter's director of Central Intelligence, an admiral by the name of Stansfield Turner, who was a Naval Academy graduate, on the surface of Mars or wherever they were sending us. And there was a very perseverant, but I found ultimately very annoying Texan who was acting like we weren't in any kind of peculiar environment. He may have been trying to whistle past the graveyard and convince himself that he wasn't off planet. But I remember encountering a very talkative Texan who was very quick to make a joke, very quick to laugh, but was ultimately annoying me because I just discussed with Bernard today the fact that he agrees that he certainly, just like I, never really relaxed when we were on the surface of Mars. It was just too dangerous and too fraught with peril and legitimate trepidation for our well-being to really let down and relax. But we had encountered this very, very genial, very talkative, very colorful Texan. And I don't want to say who it is, but one of his family members has corroborated to me that H. Ross Perot apparently knows who I am, knows me by name, and may have both jumped several times or extensively and may have financed the Mars jump room program. So there's a new line of inquiry here whether there was a Ross Perot connection to the jump room program. But isn't it curious that Barack Obama and I were trained together as now and served together as corroborated by William Stillings, Bernard Mendez, and now William Whitecrow, have verified what the Obama administration tried to lie about, which is Obama's involvement in the Mars jump room program. And now we've established that Texas we met along the way there on Mars could very well have been another presidential aspirant, Perot. So they had something in mind by sending those who would either become president, like Obama, and those who at this point in time we know sought the presidency but have not yet won it, namely Ross Perot and myself. So I'm in possession of excuse me, I'm in possession of an email by Ross Perot to one of his family members that states, hey, listen, I know who Andy is. If I need to get in touch with him, I will. And that family member has stated to my contact that Ross corroborated our account because he was in the program. That's just wild. I didn't expect that. You know, it's kind of like being in college. If you think back to your college, your high school years, you can remember who some of your best friends were. You remember things you did, but it may take somebody jogging your memory at a high school or college reunion for a specific person or a specific event to come back into focus. And that's how it's kind of been with my memories of being in Project Pegasus and in the Mars jump room program, is you don't remember everything. And I certainly had repressed my encounters with a Texan in his 50s who seemed so oblivious to the fact that we were on somewhere else, off planet, that he was kind of not annoying me, but he was making me edgy because I didn't sense he had a real strong focus on, let's say, looking out for predators, which as a guard on the program was one of my tasks.
What do you intuit he was going through, going beyond just what his words were? What was the vibe you were picking up? You said nervous, uptight. What did you sense was going on with this person?
I just sensed that he was happy-go-lucky or convincing himself he was happy-go-lucky, and he was not cognizant of the fact that we were in a condition of constant peril. We were in a situation involving constant peril, and we needed to be vigilant. And so it was kind of like, I was playing catcher in the rye by, making sure there was a predator wasn't sneaking up on him behind his back, but he wasn't returning the favor and remaining vigilant. So he was just not so much annoying me, but enhancing my anxiety. But he was a nice fellow, and I had forgotten encountering this colorful Texan. And so the research line now is, was that in fact Ross Perot? And can we get an admission of his involvement from Ross Perot before he, passes, because Ross is now like 84, 85 years of age. So we want to get testimony from him before he goes on to the...
Do you remember if he was armed, if you were armed, if Stillings was armed, what you were wearing? What details do you remember? This could be quite important.
I was always armed. Stillings was not armed. He was quite young. He was only 14 when he first jumped. I was 19 when I first jumped, and I was really 20, 21, 22. I would say probably 21 during the heart of my service in 82, 83. I was always armed with a photo flash gun that was stuck in the left side of my belt. It had 3 settings: heat, stun, and kill. And hence, when we were lighting somebody's cigarette and you had to turn the little device on top of the gun to heat, the watchword when lighting a cigarette was "do the right thing." And set the device to the right, because if you set it to the left, you might, incinerate somebody's head off their shoulders. So that was a very powerful gun. It was demonstrated to me by William Stillings' father, Thomas J. Stillings of Lockheed, in their backyard in La Cañada, California, in the summer of 81. After I had been up several times, I guess around twice, I had been up by myself, and then once I went up in July of 81, and then in August of 81, the second time going up with Courtney Maurice Hunt of the CIA. And so somewhere in there in summer of 81, Brett's father showed me how to use that gun, and it was extremely powerful. It could basically incinerate a creature with utter certainty at 50 feet, and then at 100 feet, it was a little less certain that you would strike a target. But he demonstrated for me how, if I needed to protect anybody in the group from a predator that was small enough to be killed and not just antagonized by the incinerative effects of this device, that I should kind of place the gun in front of me and kind of saunter up to within a 50-degree range to kill an animal to protect one of our members. I was also, by the way, I should say, this is how serious the program was, and also people tend to caricature the CIA and other U.S. alphabet agencies, but we received ethical counseling that if we didn't want to kill a humanoid or an animal on another planet, we could sit down and allow ourselves to be sacrificed. So we were also apprised of the fact that the gun might not work on the larger predators. And so I had, in addition to a photo flash gun always with me that I kept at a locker in with a combination lock on it at the jump room site in El Segundo, California, I also always had in my pocket from the same locker a little cyanide capsule shrink wrapped in plastic. And once I showed it to one of my UCLA roommates in the dorms at UCLA, and he almost put it in his mouth. And I actually lurched across the room and grabbed his arms and prevented him from tossing it in his mouth like a piece of candy, and saved his life, because he would have died instantly if that cyanide capsule had gone into his mouth. So So yeah, we almost had a fatality on the UCLA campus from the Mars Jump Room program, and I would have had to explain why I furnished a cyanide capsule to my roommate, and probably would have been up on manslaughter charges or something. But we were not all guards. I had been tasked. I was in those days, I had extremely good vision with my corrected vision. I was 20/13, which meant that I could see things at 20 feet that other people had to walk up to 13 feet to see. So, and I was an extremely able shot with a pistol. I mean, I could strike a small target at 100 feet. So they knew that if I sauntered up to 50 feet, I could certainly take out a smaller predator that was threatening one of our group members.
How did you get to be such a good shot, Andy?
I was just a natural. I was even a good shot with a slingshot that my dad made with me with a piece of cherry wood and a piece of plastic from a bike tube, an inflatable tube from inside a bicycle tire. But I was going to say that the jump room program is so serious that I also received specialized ethical training, that if any particular jumper was threatening not only their life but the life of one other jumper arbitrarily, as a result of their behavior, and I'm talking about serious behaviors like mental breakdown or violence on the surface, I was free to isolate them in the field and execute them with the same device. So we were in a serious place. This wasn't child's play. This was a situation where people of very high caliber had been selected, of known virtue, I like to say, people who are the kind of people who not only do the right thing, but even avoid the the appearance of impropriety. The kind of people who will go the extra mile to risk their own life to save somebody else's. But nonetheless, I received ethical counseling that as a guard, if it was my independent judgment that somebody was threatening the life of another jumper besides themselves, I was basically then had to make a value judgment in the field as to whether the threat to the other jumper or jumpers would be removed by executing that person via incineration. So it was a serious.
I want to make a comment on
your.
It was serious. I understand, I wanted to make a comment on that you were a natural good shot, and we talked about another. I'm going to call her a super soldier. She was in the secret space program, and she could twirl knives very high up in the air, turn around 3 times and catch them and not get hurt. And when she was recruited as a young woman, she was under 15 or something. That was because that's an indicator of some kind of almost supernatural abilities. Because, Sasha and I have tried shooting things and we couldn't hit this broadside of a barn. But you're saying you're a natural shot, and this whistleblower's husband was a natural shot, and so he was enhanced so he could actually shoot a gun and be an assassin from, a very far distance and always hit his target. So, do you think that? I know that your father was in the program, but you were chosen because you have enhanced abilities or enhanced DNA. There was something special about you.
Well, I have a set of hybrid traits that Karen Kinnison, my chief of staff, has identified. I want to analyze those further. She just shared them with me yesterday. Mm-hmm. I don't think I'm a hybrid. I asked my mother and the widow of my pediatrician whether there was any enhancement of my mother's pregnancy with me. I certainly have a lot of hybrid traits, like I'm very sensitive to light and sound. I have a chronic sinusitis infections, which are apparently one of the symptoms. Mm-hmm. I had extensive contact with the Greys, the small Greys in early childhood, like they were visiting one of their projects. I've had the avatar or the apparitions of ascended beings. I had one of those in childhood. So I've had a set of experiences, and I have a set of characteristics that are right out of the hybrid literature, but I would guess that I might have had some kind of ET enhancement. When my blood was tested when I was a graduate student at Cambridge, in order to get on the British health plan, which is like, you can do that in these socialized medicine countries, like you would pay for a Big Mac and a Coke in the States, you can get open heart surgery in England or Sweden for, the cost of a Big Mac and a Coke. But I was told by the hematologist who took my blood that we found certain unusual qualities, but they never revealed to me. I even wrote to the doctor of that hematology lab, the consulting physician, my doctor, what she meant, and we never found a conclusion to that. I have a very low red blood cell count. That's one thing we know. That she may have just identified that I have a lot of serum and very little red blood cells. But I must confess that even though I'm a candidate for president, if you look at the emerging literature that suggests that some people are just flat out hybrids between ETs and human, and many of those are the young people being born into our society with these beautiful, large eyes that are far set apart. I don't think I'm a hybrid in that sense, but I think that there may have been some experimentation with my genetic background from either human sources or extraterrestrial ones, because I did have a set of really advanced abilities in childhood. I could levitate small objects. Mm-hmm. I had a superb memory. When we did the game in the program where the teacher or facilitator gives you a number and you have to repeat it back, and then she gives you a second number, and you have to repeat the first and the second number, etc. She took that out to 84 places and only got one digit wrong. So
Wow.
I've always had a superb memory. I've always been very observant. I've always been able to look at something or some person, a face, a name, a foreign language grouping of words, a sign in English, whatever, and just remember it eidetically to be able to write it down years later. I'm very intuitive. I'm able to pick up even things like people's nationalities based on their phenotype. I mean specific European nationalities and so forth. So, and some of that was training. But I think in the case of being a great pistol shot, I just had the natural ability that, the Sundance Kid did, Harry Alonso Longabout,
Well, I wanted to say something, and Dr. Lessin wants to say something. He's got his hand up over there.
Yeah, okay.
We interview a lot of experiencers, and Cynthia Crawford, her father was in the military, and she was born in the late 40s, and she was enhanced not just by one being, but a combination. They're able to come in and genetically introduce the variations of the enhanced ability they want you to have, depending on where it comes from. Just like they can make cats that glow in the dark. You don't have to look like a reptilian to have reptilian DNA within you, and they can take that characteristic and give it to you from somewhere. Like Robert Heinlein, when he created his beloved, she had 23 sets of different parents in her makeup to be the characteristics and qualities that he wanted to see in a person for his mate. So I just wanted to interject that. So it is possible. Oh, and the other one who recently passed, December 4th, he said that they came in and he was already born, and then they enhanced him as an infant while he was still in the hospital. And they told him how they enhanced him. Before you speak,
it's possible. Well, if you look at my kindergarten picture, I resemble strongly one of the sort of male Caucasian ET species that was actually recovered from one of the crashes in New Mexico. I think it may have been the Aztec crash. In other words, there was a group of diminutive ETs that were found during one of the crashes who looked like little Caucasian brown-haired boys, but with a huge amount of neoteny in their face, but still in all, pretty sort of Caucasian human looking. And I strongly resembled that type of ET from those drawings as a young child. For example, if you look at the youngest picture of me that I published, which is my kindergarten portrait in the checkered shirt, I look a lot like that particular ET as depicted in the previously classified drawings regarding the occupants of one of the crashes in New Mexico. They were not grays. They were more not just human, but sort of Caucasian looking. So presumably, who knows? I do know. I can say this, and that is whether the complication was the fact that he was in possession of future information at the illustrious life I would live, future career that I would enjoy, or whether I was a combination of his genetic material and my mother's and genetic material from elsewhere. There was always an ambivalence by my father in terms of his interactions with me in childhood, and especially on the project. I sense sometimes that he knew that something had gone on of that type, that he was sort of working with his own son, but also working with something else altogether. There was a profound kind of duality to my father's treatment of me. And so something like that may have gone on. Now, Courtney Hunt claimed that that a number of the children in the 1960s were already the product of a new genetic technology involving having two fathers. And when I asked him, well, who was my other father besides Raymond Francis Basiago? And he said, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And that implies that sometime when, let's say, he was a senator or president, they would have had to have harvested genetic material from JFK and planted it in specific children then being developed. But I was, of course, conceived around, if by my parents, presumably, around Christmas of 1960, a month after JFK was elected president. And then I was born 9 months or so after his inauguration. On September 18th of 1961, JFK would have given his famous inaugural address on January 20th of 61. So I'm not boasting and saying And certainly I don't want to alarm Caroline Kennedy that I have a half claim to the Kennedy estate, because I would never assert that. I certainly admire President Kennedy, but that's what Hunt said. And, Courtney Hunt was sharing information with William Stillings and I for years that was so bizarre when we said it. It was laughable. When he said it, it was laughable, but that ended up becoming true. I mean, I remember him telling me about the Iran-Contra affair in the early 80s, long before Oliver North and William Casey were household names.
Well, let me back up, because that's and I know Sasha wants to ask questions, so as soon as we're done with this one, but since you brought it up, what would be so important about JFK's genetic makeup that they would want to reproduce that? He wasn't very strong, so he had a lot of disease, but what qualities are they trying to produce?
Right, I can only guess, but one thing I've considered is they knew that the American school system was producing two types of leaders, pretty much political leaders and technicians. So, for example, a Lyndon Johnson, a Nelson Rockefeller, a John F. Kennedy, they were really powerful men in the sense that they were really gifted political leaders. They could cajole, inspire, or intimidate somebody into doing what needed to be done. In the case of men like my father and everybody at a leading engineering company like the Ralph M. Parsons Company, I mean, my dad knew Ralph Parsons personally, and I was in Ralph M. Parsons' office when Parsons was still on Wall Street, New York City, before it's moved to West Walnut Street out in Pasadena, California. And I think this kind of strength that was embodied in men like Ralph Parsons and Stephen Bechtel and men like my dad was pretty much a mathematical and engineering and design genius, is kind of technical power, the prowess to build dams and smelting plants and power plants and a space program and time travel technology. So if there was in fact a hybridization of the children of our technical class leadership with genes from some of our more remarkable politicians, my guess is it would be to produce people who could become political leaders but be able to read reports and stuff and understand them. People like Regina Dugan. People arguably maybe even like President Obama, who had some ability to read technical information and understand it. Obviously with Regina, a lot of ability to do that, but also possessed, communications ability and just the skills of just pure political leadership. That would be my guess, but I don't know. But it's really a far out thing for Hunt to claim. But again, it's one of the least credible things he ever claimed to me. He may have just been inspiring me to seek the presidency and overcome whatever inferiority complex I inherited, like most of us do, in one way or the other, because of the various miasmas that beset all families and bloodlines. We all develop different insecurities based on all kinds of disabilities and injuries and impediments that our ancestors have had, or social treatment thereof of them. So maybe Hunt was just trying to psychologically bamboozle me to believe that I could, someday acquire JFK's job at the time of his death, namely the presidency. But another possibility is that they held some political leaders in such high regard that they were hybridizing our patrilineal DNA. And just along those lines, an early picture of Nelson Rockefeller certainly strongly resembles William Stillings in any age. And when I suggested that to Brett, he was really resentful, and he said, "I don't like that." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because it suggests that I'm not myself. I'm something else." I said, "No, it doesn't. You are yourself. You are whoever your ancestors were. What if we found out that my patrilineal DNA was half Kennedy, and your patrilineal DNA was half Rockefeller? So you have, somebody has to be your daddy or daddies, So anyway,
right.
That's what Hunt said, and I'd just like to share that with your listeners, because these are the strange things that we were told and we've been trying to answer for decades, because many of the strangest things that were either said to us in training or that happened to us really happened. In other words, what was told to us about the predators on Mars wasn't even close to the reality. I mean, I saw two of our colleagues bitten in half by predators on the surface, So some of these strange kind of CIA stories we were told that you have ready access to when you're working with people at CIA, you can't believe them when you're told them, but When Freeman Fly, for example, claims that he thinks that Obama might be the genetic revivification of Akhenaten, the Egyptian pharaoh, I'm thinking, based on all things being equal, I think odds are like 50-50. That's probably the case. I met
He
Freeman
looks like
Fly.
him.
Yeah, he looks like him, and then the Secret Service names for him and Michelle and the girls are like Renegade, Renaissance, and then Rosebud and Radiance, which is right out of the cartouche for Akhenaten. There's a rosebud with sun shining on it, which they used those metaphors for the Secret Service names for Sasha and Malia. So in the immediate first family of the country, we find 4 references to Akhenaten. So is Freeman Fly that far off when he suggests that Obama is the genetic revivification of an Egyptian pharaoh? I think that chances are maybe 50-50, So because we heard so many strange stories like that, just hobnobbing with people inside the intel community where you couldn't believe the things that they were doing. I mean, at the time that they were time traveling me, they were saying that, we're now using technology that's 200 years in advance of what the public understands. Well, that was 50 years ago. So when Ben Rich of Lockheed said that anything you think we can do, we're doing, we now have the technology to take ET home, I think he was pretty much verifying the fact that we've sent astronauts outside our solar system. That stories like the this Project Serpo story that Len Kasten developed as a reporter, as a ufologist, are probably true because we heard worse, all the time. So is it possible that some of us children of the Cold War had 2 fathers? Why not? Why not?
Sasha, you have a question.
In a way, you've given yourself a key to opening up a bit when you said that you were told as a guard that you could you could kill somebody on the team if they were creating a situation that endangered the rest of the team.
Or
and
one
that
other
kind of and so the question is, what situations brought you close to where you had to consider, is this a case where I have to consider doing this? It must have been some either thing that you experienced yourself or a story specifically that you were told that made you say about this particular gun over the mantle.
Well, there was one incident where one of the jumpers came out of the jump room and grouped up with, rejoined Courtney Hunt and I on the surface. You could usually only go through the jump room with one other jumper. That was ideal. So sometimes even if there were just 3 of us who had been assigned to jump a particular morning or afternoon, if there were 3 of us at the jump room at El Segundo, what we started to do is 2 would go through, and then the odd man out would just agree to just join up with the 2 that went through. And the benefit was that the 2 who went first were with a buddy on the surface, although they were subjected to more danger when they got there because they were sitting around for the 3rd one to group up. And of course, I had the gun. So occasionally, let's say if it was Courtney Hunt and William Stillings, we would do the, once, twice, 3 shoot, and decide who would go and who would stay back. And then the 3rd person would go second and regroup up with the first 2 who had gone through. Now, one time in that kind of situation, somebody who was the the follow-up man, something happened in the jump room, and that person was discombobulated. And I don't want to say who it was, but something happened inside the jump room, and they were speaking kind of hebephonetically, in the words of psychology, Dr. Lessin, hebephrenia being rapid disjunctive speech, often caused by an immediate trauma of either injury to the brain or existential panic or an exposure event. And when we grouped up with that person as the odd man out, I then took the man who had jumped with me first over to the side, and we had a discussion whether or not it was oxygen deprivation. And I averred that it wasn't oxygen deprivation, it was a psychological condition based on something that had happened in the jump room, like some kind of phase shift that had actually affected the mental processes of this particular jumper through no fault of his own. So the jumper was being very, very hebephoretic, almost not just engaging in disjunctive speech, but sort of lashing out at us when we were trying to talk to him. So we agreed. I said to the non-affected jumper, the one who had jumped with me first, I said, I'm understanding orders basically to execute any jumper who presents a threat to one fellow jumper or more. And I said, in this circumstance, this person is a clear and present danger to both of us. And he said, well, are you going to kill him? And I said, no, I'm not going to kill a fellow jumper. Let's walk him back to the jump room and push him in and send him home. So we did. But I don't want to say who it was, because it was really a situation where I would suggest that person should tell that story. But it was apparently something that had happened in the jump room. It might have been like an energetic effect that any one of us would have experienced had we been on that jump. So there was one incident where I could have elected to end the life of one of my fellow jumpers, and I decided not to, because I didn't think that I would rather walk them back to the jump room and shove them in and send them home than, because there was always on the surface there was always somebody operating the jump room apparatus, just like you'd have somebody operating the cars in a coal mine. There was a technician standing there. So we basically pushed this individual in his hebephoretic condition and yelled, "Send him home." And he was sent home. So there was cause for that contingency plan to be implemented at that time, but I basically broke with my training and decided that it would just be something that I could not do to take the life of a fellow jumper. And I think the third man out agreed with me that we shouldn't do that it was worth the risk of our own lives, or some kind of fist fight or something on the surface. If we had to knock that guy out or something to get him back to the jump room, it was worth risking our lives or putting us in a condition of danger just to make sure that person got home. Because it was clear to us that the third man to come through the device was hebephoretic from the moment we could hear him over by the jump room. We were sort of, on the land, and it would be like sort of walking out of a men's bathroom and at 50 paces hearing somebody yelling in the bathroom. The jump rooms were sort of their own standalone facilities, and we were frequently out on the terrain when we heard somebody yell to us, like, I've come through or whatever. So that was about the size of the jump rooms. They were about the size of a restroom facility at a rest stop.
Did you hear what happened to him subsequently, or ever see him again?
Yeah, he received some specialized treatment and was resuscitated and became very active again, both jumping and dealing with the Martian use of the device to put Martians into Los Angeles. So, but it was experimental. So that seemed to be just some one-off psychological or cognitive effect of something that happened in the jump room experience. And I certainly wasn't going to execute one of my comrades just for the misfortune of having been hit by something in the jump room.
Right. Wow.
But that was what I was supposed to have done. I was supposed to have isolated him and incinerated him as a threat to Courtney Hunt and I, but I didn't.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, we're at the 48 mark, and we're going to be coming up on a break in about 10 minutes. I'd like to come up onto the election and that type of things. Are there other things you want to cover in the last 10 minutes? Maybe at the...
Well, I had this.
I think we're in it.
About the election, in my mind, I was going, well, what would a Trump, what would a Clinton, and what would a Basiago presidency look like? Say each, whoever you got it, each had an 8-year term, and that would give us some kind of interesting picture on using what you learned about the future we're going to. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I certainly didn't learn specifically of a Trump or a Clinton presidency. I learned that I'm going to reach the presidency, but I wasn't told when. So I can't say that I'm going to win. I cannot say that I'm going to win the 2016 race. But let me just give my views of a Trump presidency. I think it's clear that Donald Trump has run as an iconoclast based on his acceptance speech at the RNC several weeks ago, or a week and a half ago, and that even though he's running as an iconoclast, he is going to lead as an authoritarian. Now, the clues that he's given us are he began his acceptance speech with 10 or 15 minutes on law and order. Now, I'm sorry, but the crisis in this country is not a crisis of lawlessness. In fact, under President Obama, there has not been an outbreak in things like first-degree murder or rape or armed robbery. Criminal rates have declined, notwithstanding the recession. What there has been an outbreak on the contrary, has been in police violence. The previous doctrine that police throughout the country were legally obliged to follow, and that, to their credit, they largely did follow at risk of their life, was that a member of the community, a citizen, could be killed or at least shot with a police service revolver when that citizen had brandished a weapon or through some other means was going to commit basically a homicide, grievous bodily injury, or a sexual assault to a fellow citizen, or use potentially lethal force or perpetrate grievous bodily harm on the police.
Hello?
Well, yeah, I was just coughing there. What?
Okay.
Hold on, just a sec.
Mm-hmm.
What's happened is that the police have been practicing their profession with a different standard, which is they're shooting civilians and killing them because they present a potential threat to the police. And I'm sorry, but one aspect of policing is that some police are going to die in the very act of trying to maintain the cardinal principle of preserving civilian life, even if some civilians take the lives of the police. That was the historical standard, and that was the reason for the walls of honor at our police stations, was the fact that policing was such an honorable profession because either as a result of being victims of homicides or of accidents in service to the community, in the act of protecting, in the sacred tradition, the noble profession of protecting and serving the public, the police knew when they put on that badge and were graduated from the police academy and given a service revolver that they might potentially lose their lives before, let's say, they got a draw on a bad man. Now what they're doing is, if, for example, they yell for you to get out of your car and put your hands out and somebody complies, and then that person, let's say a young person, reaches back to pull out their wallet out of their back pocket, they're not waiting to see whether that thing that the person is getting from behind them is a gun or a wallet. They're shooting the person multiple times, even shooting them when they're on the ground. So what I'm saying here is the police in the United States are perpetrating an epidemic of violence on the American people, in which all of us now must be afraid of being executed by the police because of the police's suspicion, their mere suspicion that we might present a lethal threat to them. That's not the historical standard. So there's been a diminution of police work where the police are now firing on citizens who might present a risk to them. Now, that was the responsible thing for Donald Trump to address, or any presidential candidate to address. I've addressed it in 3 of my 100 proposals, where I've addressed police violence, police monitoring of police, and the emergence of the police state. Okay? In other words, I've called for federal prosecution of police involved in egregious acts of police violence. I have called for technical monitoring of the police by themselves, namely body cams on cops. And I've called for an end to the police state in terms of the repeal of the repressive legislation on the heels of 9/11 that led to what initially led to this wave of police violence, which is the federalization and the militarization of state and local police. Okay, now, as a conservative and as the standard bearer of the Republican Party, which always supported that use of force doctrine by our police, it was the partisan and historical obligation of Donald Trump to speak in terms of the conservation of the Bill of Rights and of the citizenry, the lives of the citizenry, by stating that we have a crisis in this country. And it may have begun and been exacerbated by the fact that we have an armed population and there were more police homicides. I mean, when a policeman, let's say with California Highway Patrolman, there were a number of incidents like this in California where one of the chips would go up to somebody's window to give them a speeding ticket and they would be blown away, okay? So I'm not saying that criminal elements in the citizenry were not at least partly responsible for this collapse in police standards. But we do have a crisis of police violence that involves the excessive willingness of the police to use lethal force on unarmed civilians or even armed civilians who are not firing their weapon at the police. I'll give you one example. The previous standard was if you pulled a pistol out of your pocket to drop it on the ground, the police didn't shoot you. They just trained their gun on you. Now, anytime you show that you're in possession of a gun, they will shoot you, and they will shoot you to kill. So that's what he should have addressed, but instead he gave a 15-minute lecture on law and order. So Trump is going to... Yeah.
We're at the top of the hour, Andy. Sorry to interrupt you, but we will be back in about 5 minutes. So please remember where you were about the police, and we'll rejoin that after this break.
It's only 3 minutes.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Tuesdays at 12 noon Eastern on Studio A to hear Tammy Adams share her knowledge of an unknown realm on Talking with Your Angels. Join Tammy as she uncovers hidden secrets about the spiritual world of angels, ghosts, and other entities that have been with us longer than we know. Tammy is a psychic, a teacher, spiritual coach, a leader in her field, and will be sharing her information and stories with you. So join us on Tuesdays at noon on Studio A. With Tammy's guidance, you'll find out who has been watching over you from the other side, and soon you will be talking with your angels.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
This is Thomas, a.k.a. a Mad Painter. I'd like you to join me Monday nights, 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Open Canvas. Don't forget to bring an open mind.
Yes, folks, that's right. Bring an open mind to an open canvas. Again, that is Monday nights, 10 p.m. Eastern. UFOs to government corruption. This is Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here.
This is the people's war. It is our war. We are the fighters. Fight it then. Fight it with all that is in us. And may God defend the right.
Warning! Warning!
We gotta stop them! They're gonna kill us all! See how the trouble you've started? Be they a government, be they industry, be they organized labor, be they anyone, or human beings. Time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, by all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported talk radio station, throwing ourselves upon the gears of the machine. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
You called down the thunder, well now you got it. Right! You tell them I'm coming! And hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me!
Revolution Radio! The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Aloha, everyone, and welcome back to the Sacred Matrix on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. And I'm your host, Janet Carol Lessin, with my co-host, Dr. Sasha Lessin, and we are interviewing presidential candidate Andrew D-Basiago. But before we get back to our show, I'd like to remind everybody that our Revolution Radio is listener-supported, so please go over to the donation button on freedomslips.com. and donate what you can. $1, $5, $15, $20, whatever you donate will be greatly appreciated. And we do thank you very much for your donation. Dr. Lessin, what would you like to say?
Okay, so we're getting back to Andy Basiago, who is a write-in candidate for President of the United States. And I had asked him, what would you imagine an 8-year Trump or an 8-year Clinton or an 8-year Basiago presidency would be like? And we talked about Trump being basically leading us to a fascist state. That's as far as we got with the following the trend of increasing police militarization under a Trump presidency.
Right, and you were talking about an incident where the police, whatever it was. Go back to your story.
Well, I was stating that
please.
I think that the indications are that even though that he's led that he has run for president in a way that suggests that he's an iconoclast who is not beholden to any political interest or financial interest. We cannot say that Trump would be a libertine leader. He signaled, in fact, that he would be an authoritarian leader, really on the Latin American dictatorial line, even though he's not a general. For example, I was just talking about how he spent the first 10 or 15 minutes of his acceptance speech to the Republican National Convention talking about law and order and blaming crime for the epidemic of police violence around the country. And I was just describing how what has actually happened is that the abiding doctrine that the police can only fire on a civilian when they present a clear and present danger of death, grievous bodily injury, or sexual assault to a civilian, or when they are training a weapon on the police, has diminished so that they are now preemptively executing civilians based on their potential threat to the police. For example, when they're unarmed, but the police don't know what's in their hand, for example. And that happened to that young man recently in Fresno. So that's and other indicators that Trump is going to be an authoritarian leader that none of us would want in the White House, especially as we pull out of this recession, is his statement that he was considering Trey Gowdy for Attorney General, that he was not going to repeal the Patriot Act. He mentioned getting rid of the TSA, something wrong with the TSA scanning, but he didn't talk about repealing the Patriot Act, and he didn't talk about ending the unconstitutional warrantless searches that the National Security Agency is perpetrating by basically eavesdropping on our private digital communications. So those were all indicators that Trump will govern as an authoritarian president and reverse our creeping descent into statism, if not, I dare say, totalitarianism. So he's the wrong man at the wrong time. Now, Hillary, I must say that what frightens me about Hillary Clinton is the fact that since the Clintons left office, since President Clinton governed relatively positively for 8 years. In other words, when Bill Clinton bragged about his accomplishments at the DNC in 2000, he had a lot to brag about. I mean, the number of jobs he created, the number of people he moved from welfare to work, the number of acres of land that he saved in our national park and forest system. But in the years since 2001, the last 15 years, the Clintons have essentially morphed into a grotesque version of their original selves. They basically now are a couple who are a bunch of two individuals who have become scavenger capitalists, who have been finding different ways of moving illicit foreign money into their private bank accounts via donations to the Clinton Foundation, and basically foreign aid scams. So I would recommend to your listeners the documentary Clinton Cash, which shows how the Clinton Global Initiative specifically and the Clinton Foundation generally has been used to enrich the Clintons. Now, when I try to imagine what it would be like for Hillary Clinton to be president, I'm not a misogynist. I certainly not only support the notion that a woman could be a great president, but I have already selected, and I'm soon going to be announcing that I've asked a woman to run as my vice presidential running mate, and I will soon announce who that person is, who that woman is. But regardless of gender, what I think is going to happen under a Hillary presidency is she is going to be less popular than Bill Clinton and even less popular than Barack Obama, because she simply is not able to connect with the American people. When Hillary Clinton tries to communicate as if she's being sincere and she's getting sort of up close and personal with the American people, it comes across as the worst kind of phony delivery by an American politician. I've often said that Hillary's hated not for what she says, but for how she says it, because when you read what she says in the newspaper, it seems almost like a mannered attempt to be a centrist Democrat. But when you hear what she says, it's very off-putting. I think part of it is her truculence. Some of it is her Chicago suburban sort of accent. And she's either extremely vociferous or she's sweet and charming in a way that doesn't fly, that doesn't convince people that she is being authentic and sincere. So if Hillary wins, I see basically a 4-year term of a failed activist Democrat who will take a set of calculating positions. That's another thing that you get with the Clintons that you don't get with Trump or I, is they are not American politicians that are dedicated to the truth. They are dedicated to calculation, to whatever position they believe is in their best interest to advocate. And they've been doing it since they were at Yale Law School. Another thing I might add about the Clintons that I think will become more clear is, if we were to trust them with power, consider the fact that Roger Stone's claim in his book, The Clintons' War Against Women, that Bill Clinton is a serial rapist and that Hillary Clinton has been his enabler by leading efforts within his inner circle to harass and intimidate the victims, the female victims of Bill Clinton's sexual assaults, is uncontested by the Clintons. And what I have to ask, and again, I've avoided personal, casting personal aspersions at other candidates for most of this election. But as a lawyer and a member of the bar myself, I have to ask this. How is it possible that as a couple, the Clintons possess 2 degrees from Yale Law School, a degree in foreign relations from Georgetown, and whatever Hillary graduated with, a degree in from Wellesley, and Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar? He had to leave England, of course, because he was given a choice to either abandon his degree or stay in England and stand trial for forcible rape of a British co-ed there when he was a student at Oxford under the Rhodes Scholarship Program. How is it possible that in the 45 years since they left law school, 2 individuals who are as high IQ as they are, I mean, they're really 2 intelligent individuals. In fact, I've long admired their intelligence and their insightful grasp of different public policy issues. I like listening to Bill Clinton think out loud in particular. But here's, as a lawyer, as a fellow lawyer and now a fellow candidate, that I just can't grok. How is it possible in 45 years they've never steered Bill Clinton towards medical treatment or a 12-step program for sexual addiction? I mean, I practice law, and my fellow lawyers regularly seek assistance of the lawyer assistance program of the Washington State Bar for the problem of addiction to work, to sexual activity, to drugs, to alcohol, whatever. And I find it very peculiar that the Clintons have never done that. We have never heard, I mean, if Betty Ford could seek intervention for her alcohol addiction, how is it possible that the Clintons have decided to attack his victims, which flies against the face, especially of Hillary's feminism, but of the avowed feminism of them as a political couple, and literally attacked and intimidated his victims rather than had a metanoia in their relationship and in the life of Bill Clinton where they said, Bill, look, it's time for you to face the music. You are a sexual addict and you are hurting people as a result of your sexual addiction, not just yourself and not just humiliating your wife and your daughter, but you are aggressing against women, and it's criminal, and you should be in jail now because of your sexual addiction. We recently had a statement by Dolly Kyle, one of Bill Clinton's ex-mistresses, that he has had over 2,000 sexual partners. Well, I'm sorry, but that in and of itself is prima facie evidence of sexual addiction, not just of being a man with a healthy heterosexual regard for women, but of being a sex addict. And I just, so for me, it's, anybody can develop an addiction problem. It's part of the human condition. But what comes down to the issue of not just leadership, but of presidential leadership and discretion is when met with any kind of addiction in your own life or in the life of your spouse or any other immediate family member, do you do the right thing and steer that very redeemable person, because I believe everybody is redeemable, to the proper religious, philosophical, and particularly medical, psychiatric, and philosophical intervention to cause them to overcome this very intractable problem that many people confront at least once in their life with some form of addiction. And they haven't done that, and I think that's to their discredit.
Andy, I'd also like to sort of follow up when we think about the Clintons. And you had, on our last program, mentioned that Ron Brown was not only in a crashed airplane when he was on, very, very popular politician, but that he had a bullet to the back of his head. Could you say some more about that?
Well, actually, there have long been claims that the Clintons have assassinated people who are their political adversaries or who know particular things about them. As one who knows that they had prior knowledge of his presidency, resulting from the quantum access capabilities of the CIA attributable to DARPA achieving time travel, different forms of time travel, by 1970, I wonder whether some of these assassinations have resulted from the Clintons' attempt to conceal what I've shared with the American people. That Bill Clinton knew probably before he left Georgetown that he was a future American president. Now, one of the more high-profile deaths was the apparent crash, the apparent death by airplane crash of their Commerce Secretary, Ronald Brown. And I investigated that case because even though my father was already deceased, the chairman of my father's employer, the Ralph M. Parsons Company in Pasadena, was on that flight. And so I dug into the different studies of that crash, and one thing that was conspicuous is Ron Brown had a circular wound, not in the back of his head, but in his forehead, as if he had been executed on the ground. And that is not without precedent. We now know that Dag Hammarskjöld's plane was downed by Rhodesian mercenaries, and he was executed on the ground in 1961 when Hammarskjöld, who was then the General Secretary of the UN, was attempting to negotiate a peace in the Belgian Congo, in the Katanga province, on behalf of the UN and the mission of the UN to seek peace. So that's the question, is whether Ron Brown was actually assassinated with a bullet to the head on the ground, or on the plane. There's some evidence that he might have been. And I was referring to the great number of mysterious deaths that surround the Clintons. And I would think that would be not so much that initially they were a bloodthirsty couple. What I suspect may have happened to them is that they're so jovial and talkative that they just let slip too much, that they had prior knowledge of their presidency, and they were going about CIA was going about killing their Clinton's, some of their Yale Law School classmates and that sort of thing. One of the early deaths was in one of his fellow Rhodes Scholars in England. So I just don't, I haven't reviewed those cases. So as an attorney, I feel uncomfortable commenting and hanging those deaths on the Clinton as if they were homicides. But there's certainly been a lot of that has surrounded them. And now when you look at the grotesqueries that they have personally become in descending into the gutter of basically international scavenger capitalism, basically ripping off national governments, the poor, the American people, and international aid organizations by running these shakedowns that distort the international foreign aid system in places like Haiti after the severe earthquake there. I really think that the Clintons have lost sight of any concept of basic morality, and that's a principal concern that I have more with Hillary Clinton than with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a kind of an interesting character study. I know that people around him say that he's very generous and genial, and I also know from somebody that I met in the real estate development field that he only sleeps 4 hours a night, so he's a hard worker. He might be an interesting study as a president if he receives guidance, the guidance he needs to focus on America's problems rather than isolating particular groups of Americans to scapegoat. I'm concerned, however, that he doesn't do so, because look at him mocking that reporter for the New York Times who was suffered the misfortune of being born with a defective arm. Trump not only mocked that man, but he emulated his deformed right arm in the process of mocking him. And I'm sorry, but not making fun of the disabled or those who are blind or deaf is something that we all learn, if not in kindergarten, during our grammar school years. And I think being born into a $400 million estate, that's something that Donald Trump didn't learn as a youngster. And I think that alone makes him an inappropriate choice to be our national leader and the representative of our country to foreign peoples and governments.
So we started this second half, and we're talking about what would a Trump presidency look like, what would a Clinton presidency, and what would a Basiago presidency look like. I'd like to address some issues, and perhaps you could comment. You might not know everything 100%, but what would women's equality look like under the three candidates, President yourself and Clinton and Trump? How would that pan out? What do you think?
Equality? Well, I think I'm.
Yeah, like.
I consider myself. Are you talking about gender equality?
We could go.
Yes, we are losing ground.
Equality, we're losing ground. I'm a child of the 50s and 60s. I saw, how we came. I was watching on the plane back home, and they had a thing about women and how we evolved and grew and gained equality, so to speak. But in the 50s, Ricky Ricardo took Lucy over his lap and spanked her. And I had forgotten all about that, and I was appalled. I go, yes, that's how they treated women back in the 50s. Like they were bad little girls and we could be spanked. And then here, so I'm very afraid that we would go back to that kind of reality under some of the things that are being said now. So, yes.
Well, I consider myself a feminist. I grew up in a family with both brothers and sisters, and my parents reared the five of us so that there was no distinction on a gender basis as to whether, for example, we should all be educated and have our own professions. So my parents were kind of progressive in terms of treating my sisters, even though my older siblings were all born in the 50s. I was born in 61. Well, my one brother was born in 1960, but that was the end of the 50s, right? And we were all reared so that there was an expectation that we would all go on to college and our particular professions, and that my sisters necessarily wouldn't be dependent on husbands to be financially and professionally successful. I do not believe that we've made the progress in gender equality that we attribute to ourselves as a nation. For example, in 2010, only 5% of new jobs in corporate America went to women. The glass ceiling still exists. And there's still a discussion of whether or not a woman should have a right to choose abortion. It's reared every time, it raises its ugly head every time I comment about what my abortion policy is. So let me share that with you. Mm-hmm. I support a woman's right to choose abortion because I believe that pregnancy is a uniquely female condition that goes on in the bodies of women, and I believe that women should possess sovereignty over their own biological functionings, just as a man would assert he would have the sovereignty to do. So I support the right of women to choose abortion, that every abortion is the termination of a potential life, that none of us would choose it for ourselves if we could retroactively, or if we could hypothetically consider the possibility that our mothers may have aborted her pregnancy with us. And also every child is not just sovereign and beautiful, but every human life contributes to, for example, economic well-being. At least as population grows, society becomes more prosperous. So I follow women to choose abortion with promoting programs to encourage women to bring their pregnancies to term, not to force them, but to give them the opportunity to do so. For example, I believe that society should fund women bringing their pregnancies to term, where economic decision-making is the cause, and not, let's say, medical decision-making is the cause for the abortion. The reality is that even though we talk about a woman's right to choose, often abortion is chosen because of economic constraints. So I would try to free up those economic constraints to encourage women, where possible, to bring their pregnancies to term because of the reasons I stated that go to the sovereignty or the potential life of the child. But I think as an ultimate, law exists at the margin. We're making decisions at the margin of human experience. And at the quick and threshold of pregnancy is the fact that only women get pregnant, and it is a woman who has to decide whether she's going to bring her child to term or not. And so the question becomes not whether the fetus should be treated as a sovereign life, not whether children are beautiful, not whether new lives benefit society. The question is whether that woman has sovereignty over what's going on in her body. And I believe that women possess that sovereignty, and so I support a woman's right to choose abortion. So I am a feminist. I also believe, for example, if you look at my 100 proposals, in my gender equality proposal, I suggest that companies over a certain size should be fined for not achieving gender equality in their allocation of positions at the executive class, the managerial class, and the rank and file. In other words, we shouldn't tolerate not just the glass ceiling, but the fact that women are being discriminated against in employment in the United States, so that every time we enter a recession like this, women are being literally debased and enslaved in dishonorable professions like erotic dancing, exotic dancing, and prostitution. And I've tracked this in the advertising realm. When we have a recession, the use of the internet and local newspapers, for example, to provide opportunities in prostitution for women far exceed the growth in the job listings. And nobody ever talks about that. The fact that we haven't achieved gender equality in hiring, not even with the mainstream, corporate America, the Fortune 500 companies that would state that they've achieved gender equality. They haven't. So women are being forced to not work and to rely on different kinds of male partners, whether they be husbands, boyfriends, family members. Every time we have a recession, and even when we're in prosperous times, we haven't achieved gender equality. So I am a feminist, and I believe that the office of president should be used to achieve gender equality. I believe, like the Native Americans, that women hold up half the sky, and they have a right to half the jobs and half the prosperity and half of the decision making inside of the couples that they're in, whether they be married or in committed relationships. And I believe that they should have sovereignty over their pregnancies. So I am a feminist, and I would dare say I may be more of a feminist in calling for that law creation than even Hillary Clinton herself is.
Mm-hmm. Sasha.
Oh, I just Mary Renault, and all the wine is gone. talks about when the Spartans had surrounded Athens, how the young man is going out and he's acting as a prostitute, and he's ashamed to see his sister is doing the same. And so we can see that economic hardship makes us all slaves.
I mean,
back in Athenian times.
Look, every time that there's a recession, there is greater economic exploitation of females. In fact, you can follow the forms of homicides that occur when economic times are dear. When they're hard, there's more stabbings of male victims. When economic times are prosperous, there are more shootings of female victims than male victims. So there is a gender dynamic that's linked to the fundamental economy. And what is never talked about by feminists or sociologists is the fact that when we are in economic hard times and there's growth in joblessness, there's a growth in the professions that exploit women. Stripping, prostitution, lap dancing, and this kind of demi-monde in which women are encouraged to take forms of economic activity that you wouldn't want your wife, your girlfriend, your sister, your daughter to take. And I'm focusing on that. It's something that people are squeamish about, but nonetheless, it's a real phenomenon, and it's one that feminists do not talk about, I think, because it seems to derogate women. But it shouldn't. It's a form of economic exploitation that is that results from economic hardship, and we will only reverse this when mass employment, when we focus on gender equality and mass employment, because in fact we're moving towards a society where competence in getting basic tasks performed is more of a focus in the general economy than brawn. We are no longer a blue-collar economy. And therefore, the tendency of men to be brawnier in adulthood is less relevant than the general intelligence and diligence of the employee, which is not a gender-linked trait or characteristic. A diligent employee in a white-collar economy is simply a diligent employee, regardless of gender. And so we have to focus on wage discrimination and on employment discrimination targeting American women, because it is still a very real phenomenon. And my point is, during times of economic decline, the opportunities for women to be debased in dishonorable professions skyrockets, and we've ignored that. Even those in the Democratic Party have failed to address that aspect of American society, and I think more than a few PhDs should be written about it, and we should address it and provide economic opportunity for women.
Another angle that I have, because I'm an anthropologist, is how I've seen that prostitution, which is a derogatory term, but we could say courtesanship, was a high profession, higher than a dentist or a doctor or a bricklayer even. And so that is another way, is to professionalize sexual services and to honor them rather than to criminalize them.
Well, I'm a libertine. I'm not a prude. So if American society decided to become more like Japanese society and did that, I might not necessarily oppose it. But currently, the state of prostitution in the United States is such a severe profession that one of the common ways that women leave prostitution is via suicide, for example, via drug overdose. So until prostitution is made a gentle and honorable profession in the United States, I would rather seek that we put our energies on creating economic opportunity in the honorable, or what we currently hold out to be the legal and honorable professions, which is, conventional employment rather than employment in prostitution. I certainly wouldn't, being somewhat of a libertarian, I wouldn't want to stop women or men who want to be in the sexual services industry from practicing their profession if, in fact, they've selected it rather than it's selecting them. My concern is that during periods of economic decline in particular, the industries that utilize or exploit women sexually select the women rather than the other way around.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah. So we've been addressing that problem as a community, looking at what creates prostitution, and so that might alleviate some of the problems if we would look at it differently, like they did in the ancient times as a sacred, a sacred prostitution.
Well, we're also
now,
a violent society,
society.
So no, Janet, we always have, we have to acknowledge, though, we are a violent society with mass gun ownership. So what prostitutes actually are confronted by is the risk of being killed by their johns, severely injured, having their teeth knocked down their throat. I mean, being shot, stabbed, contracting a venereal disease. And that's why I think, because of the degradation, it's commonplace for prostitutes, or at least it's very high for prostitutes society. I don't think we can be naive and suggest that we could evolve into a society where sexual courtesans would be honored and elevated as leading citizens, such as has existed in some more enlightened societies, as long as we remain a violent society.
So there's a correlation with the fight with violence.
Well, I mean, if we're going to protect,
I'm sorry. How would you deal with a violent society? That's exactly.
I'm suggesting that the same thinking that would cause us to try to provide economic opportunity for women in the conventional economy, rather than, for example, in the sexual services sector of society, in the same way that we would not want our sister, our daughter, to become a prostitute, certainly in this kind of society. I think in terms of the honor issue of that, I think there's a more practical issue of the safety of that, of what occurs to prostitutes in American society. That's all I'm saying. It's kind of like being realistic about race. You know, we can tell ourselves that we're a colorblind society, but then if white people don't stop, literally interdict episodes of racial profiling that are being directed at African Americans, we are not a colorblind society. And in the same way, I would extend similar thinking to the issue of prostitution. As long as we remain a violent, gun-toting society where there is great violence directed at women and great violence within domestic situations. I mean, I've practiced family law for 20 years, and I can tell you that there's a lot of domestic violence in this country, and a lot of it is around money and around sexuality. So until we change the basic formulations of society and reduce the stress levels, for example, by adopting the one tax and making Americans prosperous and redefining gender, I think it's naive to suggest that we could quickly evolve into a society that would elevate the status of prostitutes, because if we encourage prostitution against the grain of how prostitutes are actually treated in American society, we are actually creating additional female victims of male violence by promoting prostitution. What we're not doing, and especially with the advent of the internet, is we are not maintaining a social discourse on why prostitution dishonors women in this society and should be something that should be discouraged. And that's unfortunate because, you know, as you know, prostitution is booming as a result of the advent of the internet, and I don't think that's a good thing. Even though I'm a libertine and I'm certainly not a prude around the issue of sexuality, I would defend people's right to practice prostitution. But as I said, my impression as somebody who's practiced family law for 20 years is that a woman will frequently sort of be chosen by stripping, and also because she can make a lot of money stripping, but that's not a decision that's made independent of all other social factors. A young woman may choose to become an exotic dancer not because she wants to be an exotic dancer, but it's because it's the only profession that she can find at that age that pays so well. And that's not really a matter of choosing your profession. That's a matter of sort of being financially coerced into taking your clothes off and performing symbolic sex acts for strangers, which is what exotic dancing has evolved to in many of our cities. So,
it's so parallel to what happens to poor people in the ghetto who go into the military because they're safer in the military than the streets of their ghetto.
Yeah. So I think I've said enough on that, but I think that the chief message I would send is, look, let's really get the numbers on gender equality, because when I've framed this argument, people have argued with me and said, look, there is no issue of gender equality. In fact, girls are being favored in terms of admission to college. There are more young ladies in college and university than young men. there are special programs that the major corporations run, and they're actually hiring more females than males. And there's actually been a shift towards the masculinization of poverty rather than the feminization of poverty. So as president, I would commission a major study into this issue and really ask ourselves, have we really achieved gender equality, or is it just something that we give lip service to? I suspect, given the number of women I know that are completely unemployed right now compared to the men I know, and relying on some form of state or assistance from some man in their life or group of men, I suspect that the feminization of poverty and joblessness is still with us. That's what I suspect, but I think it has to be quantified.
What do you think of creating a basic minimum needs economy? They were trying to do an initiative, I think.
And the one tax, I was interested in what you meant by that, too.
Right, but I'm asking a question now. So, certain societies, I don't know where it was, over in Sweden or something. Recently, they voted on a basic minimum needs economy where everybody's basic needs will get met.
Well, let me say in prescript, Janet, that when women are talking, I'm now trying to practice Pavarotti's advice to Sinatra, which is close your mouth. So I was trying to wait there until you completed your point, because there's always that male predilection in American society to talk over women, and it's really ingrained. So that's another thing that men can begin practicing, is respecting women's intelligence and letting them talk as much and finish what they're saying, and practice the Pavarotti advice to Sinatra of close your mouth. But you asked about the basic needs economy. This really is where essentially the rubber meets the road in terms of where we are in current politics. The reality is that automation of the workplace replaces jobs, and the overall economy does not basically eliminates jobs, and the overall economy does not replace them. That is a fact. The only American political leader that I've ever been able to find has ever addressed the inevitability of this and the small number of choices that it leaves us is one of our most, I think, brilliant politicians, which is Governor Brown of California, Jerry Brown, although he kind of lost my faith when he drove through that mandatory vaccination law in California. But still, Jerry has been a fairly visionary politician over the years. When he was first governor and he bought a satellite for California, and he was ridiculed as Governor Moonbeam by Mike Royko of the Chicago Sun-Times. But that California satellite is actually still paying dividends to California. It's still making California money. So Brown has really been a progressive visionary in government, and he alone has addressed this phenomenon. Now, it leaves us basically with two choices, and neither of them is that appealing, but I think I know what the right choice is. We can ignore this fact and accept a growing underclass of unemployed and underemployed people, particularly young people who, even if college educated, cannot find employment. Or we can recognize that there should no longer be a necessary independent connection between employment and income, which goes against the basic Calvinist impulses of the atomistic competition of finance capitalism that Adam Smith wrote about being such a great thing, that it produces, competition produces quality, it produces excellence, it produces low cost, etc. The bottom line is that the United States is a conservative, Protestant, Calvinist country that has difficulty embracing certain necessary forms of socialism, even when it's staring us in the face. Okay, I'm not a Calvinist, a Protestant, or a conservative. I was raised as a Roman Catholic. I have investigated the literature of socialism as an economics student at Cambridge, and I am a registered Democrat. And I believe that government should be used to create a minimum income that would be paid to everybody, from you and I to Donald Trump, at roughly $2,000, $2,500 a month, so that we use this as an instrument to eliminate poverty. Now, I should add that there have been some very interesting conservative economists who have called for this very economic alternative. Among them, Milton Friedman, the conservative economist that inspired, among other people, Ronald Reagan. Milton Friedman supported the guaranteed minimal income, which I call it, also known as the basic income guarantee. The concept is if you find a way to raise tax revenues, in my case it's with a 0.5% to a 1% tax on all bank withdrawals, which as a fixed rate tax would only discriminate against those taking big amounts of money out of their checking accounts, which would be like corporate payrolls or when corporations spend $100 million to buy a downtown office building or what have you. That would shift most of the tax burden, my one tax, that would shift most of the tax burden to corporations rather than individuals. Then you would take that huge fisc, allocate 50% of it to the federal government, 50% of it to the states, and allocate the states on a proportional population basis. So the large states, namely a per capita basis, so the large states like California would get a much greater share of those tax revenues than a small state like North Dakota, okay? Then you would use that huge reservoir of perpetual revenue stream by taking a little sip, just like animals take a little sip of water all day long. You would take a little sip out of the net movement of revenues through people's bank withdrawals. And what would you do? You would fund a guaranteed minimal income so that poverty would be eliminated. Everybody would be able to afford their shelter, their food, their medicine, and their energy, both their residential energy and their transportational energy. Get dead dinosaurs in their car to get to work. Around $2,000 a month around most of the country. It's not going to keep you alive in Aspen or Carmel or Kona, but still, or Brentwood or Bel Air, California. But in most towns and cities and villages of the United States, $2,000 to $2,500 a month is going to keep people in those resources. What do? Because you pay it to everybody, regardless of whether they're addicted to alcohol, regardless of whether they're a millionaire, regardless of whether they were born in the United States or not, you're basically utilizing the net movement of capital through the economy to enfranchise and include every citizen above a certain age, let's say 18, in the net economic activity of society. As a Cambridge economist, it's my position, a Cambridge-educated economist, it's my position that people are not poor because they are shiftless or lazy or don't want to work. Most poverty is created because the person is not internalized in the main sources of economic prosperity in the society. And I use the example that I could take any homeless person in the country, give them a shower and a haircut, and put them in a nice suit or a power dress and walk them into a mortgage brokerage and train them how to be a loan officer, because it's not that difficult. Okay, most people, if you got them off of drugs and alcohol, would have the intelligence to learn how to be making $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $5,000, $10,000 a deal writing mortgages. Now, why do they suddenly become prosperous and no longer poor? Because they're being internalized in the system of net economic activity. But there's no need to take the homeless and turn them into loan officers. We have enough loan officers. What you need to do is pay everybody a certain amount of money every month just for being alive. Now, does that mean that the poor people, or now sometimes pretty rich people, begging on the street corners, in other words, the professional grifters and transients who are panhandling on our freeway off-ramps? Yes. Why? Because it's my position that even if they're not employed, they're potentially unemployable, which is a public service. If there's a big forest fire rushing to destroy a major city or even just a smaller community, what can the police and the fire departments do? They can empty the prisons or go down to the drunk tank at a local alcohol treatment center and take people whose employment is basically non-existent, who are basically either so drug or alcohol dependent or so involved in panhandling that they're not employed, they're basically begging for money or they're being supported, and they can be conscripted into a deputy fire department to save that city. So even the person that the Calvinist devotee of capitalism would say that's a non-productive citizen, you shouldn't encourage their lazy and shiftless behavior, I force them to admit the fact that even that person panhandling on the freeway off-ramp is a benefit to society by being alive, because they can give their kidney to their brother who's a brain surgeon. They can fight a forest fire. They can be conscripted into the army if we're invaded by a foreign power. They can have a weapon thrown in their hands by a civilian resistance force if we were invaded by a foreign army and taken over. So we have to lose this. We have to lose this anachronistic capitalist Calvinist prejudice in our society that there has to be a necessary and dependent linkage between gainful employment and gain. Because look, what was the goal of economic activity after all? It was to create a leisure society, in the sense that what kind of life would people be living if everybody had a guaranteed income and we could de-link having to be employed in a job from receiving a salary? Well, adult life would be more like college, where people would have a mix of work, study, and recreation. What does everybody need? Everybody I know who's employed says, I'm really falling apart physically. I'm gaining weight, or I'm hypertensive, or I'm developing cancer, diabetes, or heart disease because I haven't had a vacation in 20 years and I'm never recreating. I'm stuck either behind my computer at work, or the wheel of my car when I'm driving home, or the television when I get home, or I'm asleep. Okay, so employment is making people sick. It's depriving them of the opportunity to develop their talents, their dreams, their minds through study and the practice of their crafts. And it is making them physically ill because of the lack of recreation and exercise. So in fact, if we introduced the basic income guarantee, the guaranteed minimal income, society would become, for adults, would become more like college, and we'd be producing healthier mid-career professionals who actually would be more productive and enhance net social prosperity while employed. The other thing that would happen is that wages would increase because there would be there would be less competition for jobs and more competition by employers to find employees. So that job at Burger King might naturally float up to $15 an hour rather than have to be imposed artificially on a command and control basis by having a minimum wage passed. Okay, so what I'm saying is, like Jerry Brown, the rest of us have to recognize that this is the 21st century, and automation is eliminating jobs, and the general economy is not replacing them. So it's a choice, but it becomes ultimately a choice between implementing the basic income guarantee or utilizing automation to create a growing underclass of the underemployed and the unemployed. And that is not any vision of a good society. And so that's my position. And I'm sorry if that offends Republicans or conservatives or those who believe in the basic nostrums of 20th century capitalism. But we're not living in that decision set anymore. That was germane to a society where you either bucked up and did something useful, or let's say a settlement on the frontier collapsed because you had too many scofflaws or too many wards of the state or too many drunks. Okay, we're not living in that society anymore. We can sustain society potentially with no more than 40% of the adult population employed at any time. We're really doing it right now. The class of people who are unemployed right now under Obama has risen to something like 95 million Americans. Okay, so that the evolution of that underclass, the development of that underclass is already upon us, and we're letting these conservative politicians stand up and state that somebody is a Debsian socialist for suggesting that we need a guaranteed minimum income. No, that's not socialism at that point. That's the fullest expression of democratic capitalism, which is the society that we've been from FDR through Johnson. Okay, under FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, we were developing these instruments of democratic capitalism. For example, we were funding a wonderful K through 12 public education system. Okay, so I'm sorry for the remaining Calvinists who think that life has to hurt and only the workers should be paid, and that the goal of our economy was never to create leisure because leisure is evil. But I would say to them, look at Australia. Look at the fact that Australia prospered even when it was paying young men enough money to rent an apartment and surf and drink beer all day. That's how Australia solved its unemployment problem. And California, if you want to believe in that Calvinist position that everybody who gets paid has to work, what about mandating certain legislation that would actually change the nature of employment? For example, California could eliminate its unemployed individuals by getting rid of self-service gasoline stations like Oregon has. Just one provision making it illegal to serve your own gasoline and mandate that there be a kid there working at the pump to pump your gasoline. Okay, so that's really where we're at the threshold of law creation, is that we have become so efficient that jobs are constantly being attrited, and we haven't even begun the discussion as supposedly the city on the hill about how we can continue to be the city on the hill with a burgeoning class of unemployed people, and that's what we have to do.
One of the things you mentioned is really like fighting a fire is a form of corvée. When I lived in Fiji, when they beat the drum in a certain way, everybody had to go and try to put the fire out, or we'd all burn down. And so that there's a possibility of corvée type activities that could be creative and artistic too, as well as baking bread, so to speak.
Look, if a man earns his employment by engaging in what the Soviets used to call social parasitism, and he stands outside a freeway off-ramp, and yet when his brother's cancer is metastasizing, he can volunteer to have bone marrow removed from his hip bone, which is kind of like being smacked in the back of the hip by a football helmet at 40 miles per hour, the goose egg that comes up when you get that needle to extract that bone marrow. Is he not useful just by begging and keeping himself alive? Of course. I'm not saying that giving a kidney or bone marrow to somebody should be mandated like it would be in China, where they would, kill you because of your religion and then remove your kidneys and other organs. But I'm just stating that the conservative economists never want to recognize that a person enriches society just by keeping themselves alive. They become that potential voluntary forest fighter. They become that potential kidney donor to their to their brother, the accountant. You see, and that's part of the equation, which means that if we create a guaranteed minimal income for everybody who's alive, including millionaires and billionaires, the transfer payment that you're doing in society isn't from rich to poor; it's from the economy to everybody. And therefore, it's
right.
And it's something that
they're all going to spend it. Most of them are going to spend it, and that money's going to go back into the economy. And then they're going to want to have apartments and places to live. So more places will be built to accommodate the money that's there to pay for the housing.
Exactly, just like Obama would have created.
Street.
Obama would have created more wealth by giving the TARP money to the families in foreclosure rather than to allow the banks to triple dip, because they would have taken care of their first need of shelter first and paid a large portion of that TARP money up to their people holding their mortgages. So, we're not utilizing these post-Keynesian models of political economy. And in fact, in public policy formation, there are few adherence to these doctrines, because even among liberal Democrats, you get a lot of kind of shallow tax and spend kind of arguments. We only have really a few individuals making these kinds of systemic arguments, and they would be like Brown of California. Ralph Nader has made some of them. Ralph Nader has a new book out called The Convergence, where he's describing the kind of society that's evolving when we don't enact these kinds of progressive provisions, which is one in which we're evolving into a nation of insiders and outsiders, and the outsiders are increasingly conscious of their outsider status. So if we're going to reverse that convergence and prevent a civil war, we want to internalize every citizen of a certain age in net economic prosperity and ending poverty. And now that we're an economy and a society that's producing net economic surpluses, we can do that in a way that we couldn't physically do when Huey Long was calling for this to be done. We are in a different world. We're not in a world in which you take from those who have and cause suffering when you redistribute. We are producing surpluses in every field, and we're either going to become a more socialist society or we're going to have civil war. That's ultimately the two paths that we now find ourselves. And I'm afraid that if people elect a plutocrat like Donald Trump president, we're going to be on that path of civil war rather than universal economic success.
I agree. We have just a couple more minutes. Where do we want to shift the conversation?
Oh, I'd like to hear what a full-on Basiago presidency would be like.
Okay, let's just run out the clock. Take it away, Andy.
Okay. I'm running for president as a write-in candidate because I did not have the $4 to $5 million that my campaign estimated was necessary to get registered to be on the ballot in the 50 states. For example, the state of Florida allows you to be a write-in with the filing of an affidavit for the presidential and vice presidential candidate. My vice presidential candidate and I have done so, and we now need to get 29 electors. And our state organizer, Kelly Vargas, is now seeking those 29 names and addresses. We don't even need signatures. But in Florida, we would have needed 119,000 signatures to get on the ballot. So your listeners need to know that the American political system is structured to prevent independent candidates from ever winning. Another example, California requires that candidates select from among 6 parties: the Republicans, the Democrats, Peace and Freedom, American Independent, the Libertarian Party, and the Green Party, or they cannot run in the winner-take-all June primary in California. You have to win that party primary to then get on the November ballot, okay? So the linchpin of partisanship in the American electoral system is what California has done on behalf of the Republican and Democratic parties, okay? What I'm saying is I learned in 2016 a valuable truth. As an independent candidate, you cannot win because you can't win California, which has more population and hence more electoral votes than any state, than all of the states west of the Mississippi River. And 2/3 of Americans now live west of the Mississippi. So California is the big enchilada, and they don't let you win it unless you register with one of the existing parties. We can still have a big impact by me winning, though, throughout the country. Even by winning one vote in San Diego County, I made the Times of San Diego as the so-called time travel candidate. But I'm not running for president to bring about universal time travel because, in fact, I oppose mass time travel by mass people on mass timelines because it would produce mass chaos. I am running as a candidate who is calling for the 3 major categories that you will find in my 100 proposals, a new agenda for a new America, at andy2016.com/proposals to bring about truth, reform, and innovation in our uniquely great American civilization.
Thank you, Andrew D-Basiago.
You got my vote, Andy.
Got my vote, Andy. Love and blessings, everybody.
So I got the vote of 2 intelligent people I know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Who owns you? If you're not in control, then someone else is. Join me, Ivy West, for Voices on the Wind, Saturday from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern in Studio A. I discuss government, health, metaphysics, suppressed science, universal mysteries, little-known incredible facts, alternative energies, and even more than you can imagine.
There is blood Won't you join us on Revolution Radio Saturdays from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern for Voices on the Wind with me, Ivy West.
There are lives in the balance, people under fire, children at the cannons.
Because if your head's in the sand, your tail is a target.